The ICU alarms were screaming. A Marine lay dying on the table, chest torn open, blood pressure in freefall. Three doctors standing over him with their hands frozen in the air, like they'd forgotten what hands were for. The attending physician shouted something about protocol. A resident knocked over a tray. And the woman mopping the floor outside the trauma bay, the one everyone called the janitor with a badge, the one they'd spent 2 years grinding into nothing, set down her bucket, walked through those doors, and took over. Nobody stopped her. Nobody could. Because the second she moved, something in that room shifted, something even the doctors who hated her couldn't explain. And every person in that ICU understood for the first time that they had made a catastrophic mistake in underestimating this woman. Before we go further, if this kind of story is what you came here for, then hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because we release new stories every week, and you do not want to miss what's coming next. Hit the like button if you're already feeling something, and drop a comment telling me your city and your country. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. People are watching from places I never expected, and every comment you leave proves that these stories reach further than any of us imagined. Now let's get into it, because this one is going to hurt before it gets better. Harlan County Regional Medical Center sat on the edge of Clarkfield, Montana, the kind of mid-sized hospital that liked to believe it was more important than it actually was. The main building had been renovated 3 times in the last decade, each upgrade announced with a press release and a photograph of the chief administrator shaking hands with someone in a suit. The parking lot was clean. The lobby smelled like fresh paint and filtered air. The website called it a center of excellence for regional trauma care. Nobody who worked the night shift would have described it that way. The real hospital, the one behind the lobbies and the press releases, ran on exhaustion and hierarchy and the quiet, grinding understanding that your place in the pecking order determined how much your opinion was worth. The attendings talked over residents. The senior residents talked over junior ones. And at the bottom of every informal ranking that had nothing to do with the employee handbook was whoever the powerful people in the building had decided to make an example of. For 2 years, that person had been Mara Voss. She was 31 years old, 5'6", lean in the way that comes from skipping meals rather than gym memberships. Her hair was dark and usually pulled back tight, not because she cared about looking professional, but because loose hair in a trauma bay was a liability and old habits were hard to kill. She had steady hands. She had the kind of eyes that tracked rooms automatically, cataloging exits and risks before her conscious mind had finished catching up. She had worked the worst shifts in the ICU for 24 months. She had cleaned rooms that nobody else wanted to touch. She had administered medications, monitored patients through the long, ugly hours between midnight and dawn, charted everything correctly, escalated when she needed to, and kept her mouth shut about the rest. She had done all of this while being called, regularly, and without much attempt at subtlety, the janitor with a badge. Dr. Garrett Foss had started that particular nickname. He was 44, tall, the kind of blonde that had gone gray at the temples, in a way that magazines would have called distinguished. He was the ICU's senior attending, not the chief of medicine, but close enough that the distinction barely mattered in practice. He had a way of speaking to nurses that technically stayed within the boundaries of professional behavior while making absolutely clear what he actually thought of them. He never raised his voice. He never used obviously cruel language. He just had an expression, a slight narrowing of the eyes, a fractional pause before he acknowledged someone's presence, that communicated with perfect efficiency that he considered you slightly less significant than the equipment. He'd used that expression on Mara the first week she arrived. By the end of the first month, it had spread. The nursing staff was not monolithic. There were people in that building who kept their heads down and did their jobs and went home to their families and didn't participate in whatever informal social cruelty was circulating through the department at any given time. But there were others who understood implicitly that aligning themselves with Garrett Foss and his assessment of Mara Voss cost them nothing and might buy them something. So they whispered. They left her off group texts about shift coverage changes. They corrected her in front of patients on points that didn't need correcting. They mentioned her name in break rooms in tones that made their meaning clear without ever stating anything directly. She couldn't make it anywhere real, so she ended up here. There's something off about her. You can tell. I heard she transferred from 3 different hospitals. You don't do that unless something happened. Mara had heard variations of all of it. In a unit that size, with those shift patterns, you heard everything eventually. She'd learned to keep her reaction time flat, to let words hit her face and not find purchase, to thank people for observations they hadn't made with any constructive intent, to move through the building like someone who had already accounted for hostility as a variable in the environment and adjusted accordingly. She was good at that. She'd had a lot of practice. What the staff at Harlan County Regional did not know, what Mara had not told anyone, had not allowed to surface in any reference check or HR conversation or casual break room exchange, was that before she became a night shift ICU nurse in a Montana hospital that used her as its designated target, she had been Staff Sergeant Mara Voss of the United States Marine Corps, assigned to the 2nd Medical Battalion, Fleet Marine Force. She had been deployed twice. She had worked trauma under conditions that the word difficult failed to adequately describe. Conditions where the equipment was what you could carry on your back, where the lighting was whatever was available, where the patients were coming in faster than any reasonable staffing plan accounted for, and where the sound of the situation getting worse was indistinguishable from the sound of the situation ending. She had kept people alive who had no business still being alive. She had made decisions in fractions of seconds that would have taken a committee an hour to debate in a civilian setting, and she had made those decisions correctly often enough that her commanding officer had submitted her name for commendation twice. She didn't talk about any of it. She didn't have it on her resume in any detail. She'd listed her military service the way you list something you want acknowledged, but not examined: dates, branch, honorable discharge, leave to interpret. Nobody at Harlan County had ever pressed her on it. In her experience, people rarely pressed on things when they'd already decided what they thought of you. The reason she didn't talk about it was complicated and sat in a part of her she didn't open very often. There had been a mission, there had been a decision, there had been a formal inquiry afterward, and an informal one that was worse, the kind conducted in looks and silences and the way people stopped including you in conversations they'd previously included you in. A fellow Marine named Decker had made a claim. The claim had been investigated and found inconclusive, which in the military's particular vocabulary meant something different than inconclusive did in ordinary speech. She'd put in her separation papers 6 weeks later. She'd driven out of the base with 2 duffel bags and a commendation that felt like a joke, and 3 years of training she wasn't sure she wanted anymore. Montana had been arbitrary. She'd driven until the landscape felt sufficiently different from anything she associated with any previous version of her life, and then she'd stopped. The nursing license had followed her from her pre-deployment coursework. The ICU job had required 2 interviews and a background check that cleared easily. The night shifts had started immediately, because night shifts were always available when nobody else wanted them. She'd thought, in some vague way, that the work itself would be enough, that she could find something like stability in the doing of it, the monitoring, the charting, the technical demands of keeping a critical care patient alive through a shift. She was good at the work. Whatever else had been taken from her, nobody could take the competence. What she hadn't anticipated was Garrett Foss. Or more precisely, what she hadn't anticipated was that civilian medicine could replicate, with such efficiency and creativity, the particular species of institutional cruelty she thought she'd left behind. The Monday before everything changed was a Tuesday. She'd worked a double, 16 hours straight because a colleague had called in sick, and the charge nurse, a woman named Brenda Sollers, who had perfected the art of being professionally neutral in every direction that mattered, had asked Mara because Mara would say yes. Mara always said yes, because saying no created friction, and friction created attention, and attention created conversation she didn't want to have. By the time she reached the final hours of that shift, she was moving on the particular fuel that exists past exhaustion. Not adrenaline exactly, more like the thing underneath adrenaline, the stripped-down animal efficiency that takes over when the higher functions have been running too long, and the body just decides to keep going without them. She was wiping down the supply cart outside Bay 7 when Dr. Foss walked past her with a group of residents. He didn't look at her, he said to one of the residents, but at a volume specifically calibrated for her to hear. Skill sets are like muscles. You either use them at the level they're designed for, or you find yourself doing something, he paused, adjacent. The residents laughed. Not all of them, but enough. Mara kept wiping down the cart. The supply cart needed to be clean. That was a fact. That was something she could control. She was still running on that thought, on the grounding discipline of focusing on what was directly in front of her. When the trauma bay doors burst open at 2:47 in the morning and the night changed completely, The patient arrived on a gurney moving fast, pushed by two EMTs who were both talking at once. Male, early 20s, uniform, military. The EMT on the left was reading from a tablet. Blunt force trauma to the chest, suspected pneumothorax, BP was 60 over palp in the rig, GCS 14 on scene, dropped to 11. Bay 3, said the charge nurse, already moving. Mara was already reading the patient. She did it without deciding to. The assessment was automatic, pulled from some archive of trained response that her conscious brain had stopped arguing with years ago. She clocked the way he was breathing, shallow, rapid, the left chest not moving the way the right was. She clocked the color of his lips, not quite right, a shade of effort in them that didn't belong. She clocked the way his neck veins looked. She set down the cloth she was holding. She was still standing outside Bay 7 when Dr. Foss arrived with the on-call resident, a young woman named Dr. Priya Anand, who Mara had observed to be genuinely capable when Foss wasn't standing next to her making her second-guess everything. Foss assessed. He gave orders. Anand followed them. The nursing team moved. Mara stood where she was and watched. The chest X-ray that came back 12 minutes later sent the bay into a different gear. Foss studied it. She could see from where she stood that he was reading it the way you read something that confirms what you wanted to be true, rather than what it actually showed. Hemothorax, he said. We're inserting a chest tube. He wasn't wrong that there was blood. He was wrong about what was driving the clinical picture, and the chest tube was going to address half the problem and miss the part that was actively killing the patient. She knew that with the same certainty, she knew her own name. She also knew that saying so would go exactly the way things like that always went. She stayed where she was. The chest tube went in. The patient's pressure, which had briefly stabilized, dropped again. His oxygen saturation followed it down. Dr. Anand said carefully, "His sats are still falling, Dr. Foss. Give it a minute." He didn't look up from the chart. 87, said the monitor tech. 85, said someone else. Mara was already at the doorway of Bay 3. She couldn't explain the exact moment she crossed it. There was no internal debate she was aware of, no conscious decision that she tracked from beginning to end. She was outside and then she was inside, and the people in the bay turned toward her with the particular mix of expressions she'd become fluent in over the past 2 years. Surprise, irritation, the beginning of dismissal. "Voss," said the charge nurse, Brenda Sollers, with a warning in her voice that was mostly professional reflex. "His mediastinum is shifting," Mara said. The tube addressed the hemothorax. "There's a concurrent tension pneumothorax that wasn't fully decompressed. You need needle decompression, second intercostal, mid-clavicular, now." Silence. Not a long silence, maybe 4 seconds. But 4 seconds in a room like that one, with a patient whose sats were at 84 and dropping, was a different kind of time. Dr. Foss turned around slowly. He looked at her the way he looked at things he found faintly offensive by virtue of existing. "You're here because—" "His trachea is deviated," Mara said. She kept her voice level. "You can see it. Absent breath sounds on the left side aren't improving because the pneumothorax wasn't the primary finding. It was secondary to tension buildup. The hemothorax obscured it on imaging. The imaging was read correctly. The imaging was read partially correctly." She moved her eyes to Anand. "Check his trachea." Anand glanced at Foss. Foss's expression didn't change. But Anand checked. She put her hands on the patient's neck and checked. And something moved across her face. "Dr. Foss," she said quietly. "I see it," he said. His voice had a different quality now. Not softer exactly, but compressed, like something being held under pressure. He looked at Mara. "Step back." "I'm not in the way. You are not authorized to be in this bay. I understand that. I'm asking you to decompress him before his pressure bottoms out completely." "Security?" "Garrett." It was one of the senior nurses, a man named Walt Ruiz, who had been working the ICU for 19 years and had the particular standing that comes from simply outlasting everyone around you. He said the one word, and then he didn't say anything else, but Foss heard it. Everyone heard it. Foss picked up the needle. He decompressed the patient. The tension broke, literally, audibly, the rush of air through the catheter, and the monitor numbers began slowly to climb. 87, 90, 93. The patient's color changed. His breathing eased. The particular quality of effort left his face, replaced by something closer to the blankness of someone who was simply unconscious, rather than someone who was fighting to stay alive. The bay went quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet after something very close to the worst possible thing fails to happen. Mara let out a breath. She turned to leave. "Don't move." Foss's voice was flat and perfectly controlled. She turned back. He was standing with the used needle still in his gloved hand, looking at her with something she recognized. Not anger, exactly, which would have been easier to work with. It was the particular expression of someone who has been made to feel something they weren't prepared to feel in front of people who weren't supposed to see it. "You entered a restricted treatment area without authorization," he said. "Yes." "You interfered with an active resuscitation." "I offered a clinical observation." "You are not a physician." "No." "You are not a resident or a fellow or anyone with standing to make clinical recommendations in this bay." She waited. "I'm filing a formal incident report," he said, "and I'm recommending your immediate termination." He looked at Brenda Sollers. "Get security to escort her out." Brenda didn't move for a moment, long enough that the hesitation registered, long enough that two other nurses in the room saw it. Then she moved. The security officers were professional about it. They weren't rough with her. They asked her to accompany them to the administrative office, and she went because she always went when she was asked to go places, because resistance created larger problems than compliance did, and she was very tired. They took her badge at the security desk. A woman from HR, someone Mara had seen in the elevator once or twice but couldn't name, met her at the administrative suite with a folder that had apparently been prepared with some speed because the timestamps on the termination paperwork were that same night's date. "We'll mail your final paycheck," the woman said. "Okay." "You're asked not to return to the building unless for a scheduled administrative meeting." "I understand." She walked out of Harlan County Regional Medical Center at 4:13 in the morning. The parking lot was cold. Montana in March cold, the kind that gets into the particular spots your coat doesn't quite cover. She crossed the asphalt to her car, a 10-year-old Subaru with a crack in the rear windshield she kept meaning to fix, and she sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. She was very tired. She was also not certain she was capable of feeling more tired than she already felt, which was a strange kind of limit to arrive at. She'd saved his life. She knew that with the same flat, factual certainty, she knew anything. The tension pneumothorax would have killed him in another 5 minutes, maybe less, given where his pressure was trending. She'd seen it, she'd named it. Foss had acted on it, even if the story he'd tell himself and others about that sequence of events would probably undergo some revision by morning. The Marine was alive. She had no job. She started the car. She was pulling toward the parking lot exit when her phone rang. Not a number she recognized, Montana area code, but she answered it because at 4 in the morning she wasn't in the state of mind to apply normal screening judgment. "Is this Mara Voss?" The voice was male, even, the specific kind of measured that didn't come from effort, but from practice. The kind of voice she hadn't heard in a long time. "Who is this?" A pause. Short, deliberate. "Staff Sergeant Voss." Her hands went still on the wheel. She hadn't been called that in 3 years. She'd structurally prevented herself from being called that. She'd built an entire life, such as it was, around the project of not being that person anymore. "I don't know who you—" "The Marine you stabilized tonight," the voice said. "Lance Corporal Derek Souza. He's 22 years old. He's from Billings." Another pause. "His commanding officer would like to speak with you." Mara stared at the dark exit of the parking lot. "It's 4 in the morning." "Yes, ma'am, I'm aware." "How did you get this number?" "We've had your contact information for approximately 14 months, the voice said. "We've been trying to figure out the right time to use it." The engine idled. Outside the hospital, the Montana dark sat on everything flat and total, the mountains invisible behind it but present in the way that large things are present even when you can't see them. 14 months, she said. "There are some things that need to be explained to you in person," the voice said. "Some records that need to be corrected. And there's a situation developing that—" He stopped. "That requires someone with your specific background." "I'm a nurse," she said. "I was just fired." "You were Staff Sergeant Mara Voss," the voice said, and there was something in the way he said it that wasn't pressure exactly, wasn't the weight of command, but was something older and less negotiable than either of those things. And we need you to listen to what we have to tell you. She sat in the parking lot of the hospital that had just taken her badge and her paycheck and her last 2 years of quiet survival. She listened. The voice on the phone belonged to a man named Major Callan Wyeth, and he asked her to meet him at a diner called Patton's on Route 12, which was either a coincidence or someone's idea of a subtle joke, and either way she drove there without letting herself think too hard about what she was doing. The diner was the kind of place that existed outside time in the specific way that truck stop diners do. Fluorescent light, laminated menus, a pie case with 3 options, and a rotating stand that turned slowly like it had somewhere to be. There were 2 other customers when she arrived, a man in a Carhartt jacket asleep over his coffee, and a woman reading something on her phone with the focused disengagement of someone waiting for a shift to start. Wyeth was already there. She recognized him before she saw the rank insignia, something in the posture, the particular way military people occupy chairs like they're always prepared to vacate them. He was mid-40s, dark-complexioned, with a scar along his jaw that had healed clean and a haircut that was regulation even at 4:30 in the morning. He stood when she came in, which she hadn't expected. "Sergeant Voss." "I'm not a sergeant anymore." "Force of habit." He gestured at the seat across from him. "Sit down, please." She sat. A waitress appeared with coffee before she'd decided whether she wanted it, and she took it because it was there and her hands needed something to do. Wyeth didn't open with pleasantries. She appreciated that more than she would have been able to explain. "Derek Souza," he said. "Lance Corporal, 1st Battalion, 7th Marines. He was in Clarkfield on personal leave. Family situation." He paused. "He's stable now." The ER attending filed a report crediting a rapid diagnosis for preventing cardiac arrest. The attending didn't make the rapid diagnosis. "No," Wyeth said. "He didn't." He looked at her steadily. "The attending also filed a separate report tonight recommending your termination, which HR actioned within the hour. Both reports are already in the system." "I know. I signed the paperwork." "You shouldn't have." "I didn't have a lot of negotiating leverage at 4 in the morning." He wrapped his hands around his own coffee cup and didn't say anything for a moment. Outside, a truck ran the light at the intersection, and the diner windows shuddered faintly. "There's something I need to tell you," Wyeth said, "about the inquiry, the one that preceded your separation." Her coffee was too hot. She drank some anyway. "I've had 3 years to process that," she said. "I don't need—" "Sergeant Voss?" His voice wasn't hard, but it had weight. A helmet camera recovered from Sergeant Decker's kit during a subsequent operation produced footage that contradicts his account of the incident at Firebase Caro. Directly contradicts it. The footage was reviewed by JAG 8 months ago. The diner was quiet enough that she could hear the pie case motor running. 8 months, she said. "The process moves slowly. I won't defend that." "What did the footage show?" He told her. She already knew what had happened at Firebase Caro. She'd been there. She'd made the decisions she'd made. She'd lived inside the consequences of those decisions for 3 years, in the particular airless way you live inside something that has no resolution. But hearing it described back to her from the outside, hearing the sequence of events as the footage had captured it, without Decker's overlay, without the version of the story that had traveled through the battalion and then through her own memory until she couldn't always separate what she'd actually done from what she'd been accused of doing, was something else entirely. She sat with it. "He lied," she said, not a question. "His account was inconsistent with the footage in several material respects, yes." "That's a careful way to say he lied." Wyeth's expression shifted by a fraction. "Yes, he lied." She looked at the table. There was a ring from a previous customer's cup that nobody had wiped away, and she focused on it because it gave her eyes somewhere to land, while the thing she'd just heard settled into whatever part of her still had room for it. "What happens now?" she asked. "That's partially what I'm here to discuss," Wyeth said. "The record correction is already in motion. Your separation documentation is being reviewed. Your commendation, the one that was pending when you filed your papers, will be formally processed." He paused. "But there's a second thing, and it's more immediate." She looked up. "We have a situation at Fort Crail," he said, "approximately 90 miles northeast of here. Military medical installation, primarily research and rehabilitation. There's been an incident involving 3 personnel and a failure in the trauma response protocol that has the installation CO deeply concerned. He let a beat pass. We need someone with field trauma experience and ICU background to assist with the ongoing clinical situation and the review. Someone who isn't embedded in the installation's existing chain of command. You want me to consult? In the immediate term, yes. In the longer term, he shook his head slightly. Let's get through the immediate term first. She looked at him for a long moment. The Carhartt jacket man had woken up and was working through a plate of eggs without appearing to register anything around him. The waitress was refilling the pie case. Everything in the diner was running on its own logic, indifferent. I don't have a badge, she said. I don't have active hospital privileges. I was fired 4 hours ago. Fort Crail is a federal installation, Wyeth said. Your military record and your nursing license are sufficient for a temporary clinical advisory role. The paperwork is already drafted. She stared at him. You were that certain I'd say yes? No, he said, and the honesty in it was unexpected enough that she almost believed him. We drafted the paperwork because we needed to be ready if you did. She thought about Lance Corporal Derek Souza, 22 years old from Billings, whose chest she'd listened to read wrong in a hallway while she was holding a cleaning cloth, and who was alive right now because she'd known what she was looking at. She thought about the supply cart, about the 16-hour shift, about Garrett Foss saying the word adjacent in a voice designed to land just inside the threshold of plausible deniability. She picked up her coffee. Tell me about the situation at Fort Crail, she said. The drive northeast took just over 2 hours, which gave her enough time for the diner coffee to metabolize and the particular species of clarity that follows genuine exhaustion to set in. Wyeth drove ahead of her in a government vehicle. She followed the taillights because she didn't entirely trust the GPS signal in the mountains this time of year. The sky began to pale somewhere around mile 80, the black going first to charcoal and then to something that wasn't quite blue but was gesturing toward it. Fort Crail sat in a valley that the mountains on either side seemed to have agreed to allow only grudgingly. The installation wasn't large, not compared to the major bases she'd been stationed at, but it had the particular contained intensity of a place where the work was specific and the people doing it were selected. 2-story medical facility, administrative buildings, a small airstrip, security checkpoint at the entrance where a young MP checked her documentation, checked Wyeth's, checked again, and waved them through with the mechanical politeness of someone running on their 3rd consecutive overnight. The installation CO was a colonel named Bet Harkin, and she met them in the corridor outside the medical wing at 6:15 in the morning, looking like someone who had been awake for considerably longer than Mara had. She was 50-something, solid, with close-cropped silver hair and the demeanor of a person who dealt with problems by naming them precisely and then addressing them in order of urgency. Major Wyeth, she said. Then, Sergeant Voss. Just Voss is fine, Mara said. Harkin looked at her with the frank, assessing quality of someone who didn't have time for the normal social pretense of not sizing people up. You look like hell, she said. I've been awake since yesterday afternoon. Can you function? Yes. Good. She turned and walked, expecting them to follow. We have 3 patients. 2 are stable, and I'm not going to insult you by pretending those are the ones I'm concerned about. The 3rd is a captain named Aldrich Payne, 37, sustained chest and abdominal trauma in a training incident 18 hours ago. He was treated on site by the installation's medical team. His trajectory should be improving. She pushed through a set of doors. It isn't. What does his current picture look like? Harkin rattled off the numbers as they walked. Blood pressure, respiratory rate, oxygen saturation, urine output over the preceding 6 hours. Mara listened and organized the data into the kind of running model she didn't know how to turn off. His lactate trend, she said, rising. Imaging? CT from initial presentation. The trauma surgeon who reviewed it cleared him for conservative management. Has anyone repeated the imaging since? Harkin stopped walking. She turned and looked at Mara. No, she said. That's the question I've been asking since midnight, and the answer I keep receiving is that the initial imaging was clear and conservative management is appropriate. Who's the trauma surgeon? Major Leonard Baird. He's been at this installation for 6 years. He is, she chose her words with visible care. He is accustomed to having his clinical assessments treated as final. Mara understood what that meant. She'd spent 2 years in a building where Dr. Garrett Foss's assessments were treated as final, and she understood with complete precision what happened to patients when a clinician's ego became load-bearing infrastructure in their care. "I'd like to see Captain Payne," she said. Baird found them in the patient's room 7 minutes later, and the particular quality of his arrival, the speed of it, the way he came through the door with his chin slightly forward, told Mara everything she needed to know about the internal politics of the preceding 18 hours. He was tall, 50s, with the florid complexion of someone who ran warm, and a voice that had probably been described as commanding by people who confused volume with authority. "Colonel," he said, without looking at Mara, "I wasn't aware we were conducting an informal round situation." "This is Mara Voss," Harkin said. "She's here in an advisory capacity at my request." He looked at Mara then. His eyes did the thing eyes do when they're categorizing fast. Took in the civilian clothes, the absence of insignia, the fact that she was clearly not military in her current presentation, and arrived at an assessment she recognized from across the table. "Advisory capacity," he repeated. "She has ICU and field trauma background," Harkin said. "I'm sure she does." He moved to the patient's chart with the deliberate ownership of someone reclaiming territory. Captain Payne's management is appropriate to his presentation. Rising lactate in post-trauma patients is not uncommon in the first 24 hours and doesn't automatically indicate. "His pressure is trending down," Mara said. Baird stopped. "Excuse me?" 60 minutes ago, his MAP was 71. The last reading was 68. She had reviewed the chart while Harkin briefed her in the hallway. She had the numbers in the order they'd occurred. "That's not noise. That's a direction." "I'm aware of my patient's hemodynamics." "Then you're aware that conservative management in the context of falling MAP and rising lactate is a decision that needs to be actively justified rather than passively continued." The room had a particular quality of silence now. Captain Payne was sedated and unaware of any of it, which Mara found bleakly appropriate. The patient always had the least to say about decisions made in his name. "You are not a physician," Baird said. The words were so similar to the ones Garrett Foss had said 8 hours ago that Mara almost laughed. "No," she said, "I'm not. I'm asking you to explain your clinical reasoning." "I don't answer to—" "Major Baird." Harkin's voice was quiet. Very quiet. The kind of quiet that outranks volume by a significant margin. "Answer the question." He answered it. His reasoning was not unsound in isolation. The logic held for a patient whose post-trauma trajectory was uncomplicated. But Mara had been listening to patients not as abstractions for long enough to know that Captain Payne's trajectory was not uncomplicated, and she said so specifically, naming each data point and its relationship to the next, building the picture the way she'd learned to build pictures when the picture itself was the only argument that had a chance of working. When she finished, the room was quiet again. Baird's jaw was tight. "You want me to order a repeat CT?" he said. "I want you to consider whether 18-hour-old imaging is sufficient to explain his current clinical status. That's a question I'm asking. The decision is yours." He hated her for it. She could see it clearly. The specific heat of someone who has been maneuvered into a position where the only available path forward is the one they didn't choose. He ordered the CT. The results came back 40 minutes later, and they showed what Mara had suspected they would show: a slow bleed. Not massive, not the kind of catastrophic hemorrhage that announces itself loudly and immediately. The kind that sits and waits and trends in one direction with the patience of a thing that knows it has time on its side. Captain Payne went to the OR within the hour. Mara sat in the corridor outside the imaging suite on a plastic chair that was slightly too low and drank bad coffee from a machine that charged $1.50 for the privilege. She was beyond tired now, in the territory past tired where the self becomes strangely light, where the ordinary friction of existing in a body is replaced by something almost translucent. She hadn't slept in approximately 22 hours. She had lost her job. She had driven 90 miles into the mountains before dawn. She had, in the space of a single shift, correctly diagnosed 2 patients that 2 different senior physicians had misread, and in both cases the response from the physician in question had been to treat her identification of the problem as a personal offense rather than a clinical contribution. She thought, sitting on that plastic chair, about the supply cart, about the way the hallway had looked from the position of someone who was supposed to be cleaning it, about the 2 years she'd spent constructing a life that was deliberately smaller than the one she'd had before, because smaller meant fewer surfaces for the wrong things to attach to. She didn't know exactly what Wyeth's presence in her life right now meant. She didn't know what Fort Crail meant, or what the record correction meant, or whether the version of herself that existed before Firebase Caro was something she was capable of reconstructing, or whether trying to would produce only a bad imitation of it. What she knew was that she was very tired, and that she had been right twice tonight, and that right now, in a theater somewhere in this installation, a 37-year-old Marine captain was in surgery instead of in a bed dying slowly and quietly because she had named a number, and then named another number, and then refused to stop asking the question. That felt like something. She wasn't sure what it was yet, but it felt like something. She was still working through that thought when Wyeth appeared at the end of the corridor. He was walking with purpose. Not running, but the thing adjacent to running when you're trying not to communicate alarm and not entirely succeeding. There was someone with him, a woman, also in uniform, compact and fast-moving, with a tablet in her hand. Mara straightened in the plastic chair. Wyeth reached her and stopped. "The incident report from Harlan County Regional," he said. "The one Foss filed tonight. It went up the chain faster than it should have." "What does that mean?" "It means someone at the hospital, not Foss, someone above Foss, flagged your name specifically, cross-referenced it." He glanced at the woman beside him who handed him the tablet. "The flag connected your nursing record to your military file." Mara felt something cold and specific settle in her chest. "Who flagged it?" "We're still determining that," Wyeth said. "But the flag wasn't random. Whoever accessed your file tonight knew what they were looking for." "Someone accessed my military file. Through a channel that should not have had access to it, yes." He turned the tablet toward her. "There's something else. The inquiry into your separation. The review that JAG completed 8 months ago. That record was also accessed tonight. Same timestamp window. About 40 minutes after you left the hospital." She stared at the tablet. "Someone at that hospital," she said slowly, "knew who I was before tonight." "That's what the access pattern suggests. Yes." The corridor was empty except for the three of them and the institutional hum of fluorescent light. Down the hall, somewhere past the set of doors that led to the administrative wing, a phone was ringing. "Wyeth," she said. "Why would a civilian hospital administrator have a reason to track my military history?" He didn't answer immediately, which was its own kind of answer. "There's a connection we haven't fully mapped yet," he said, "between the installation here and Harlan County Regional, a research partnership, joint program, federal funding. Baird has a consulting role that crosses both institutions." She looked at him. "Baird," she said. "Baird knows Foss," the woman with the tablet said. It was the first time she'd spoken. Her voice was even and precise. "They've worked together on 2 grant-funded projects in the last 4 years. The program officer who manages the federal side of the funding is someone we're now very interested in speaking with." Mara stood up from the plastic chair. Her legs were stiff and her back hurt, and she was running on coffee and adrenaline and the particular bloody-mindedness that had kept her functional through worse than this. And she stood up because sitting felt wrong now, felt like the wrong posture for what was becoming visible. "Someone connected to this installation knew I was at that hospital," she said, "knew my background. And when I surfaced tonight, when I couldn't stay quiet and the situation forced me into the light, someone moved very fast to make sure I was gone." Wyeth held her gaze. "That's what the evidence suggests." "What does that mean for Payne?" she said immediately. "If Baird is—" "Captain Payne is in surgery with a team that Harkin personally assembled," Wyeth said. "He's not at risk from Baird right now." "But Baird knew his imaging might be missed." The corridor went very still. "That's a significant accusation," Wyeth said. "I'm not making an accusation," she said. "I'm asking the question that the access pattern and the timeline and the clinical picture are all pointing toward." She looked at him steadily. "Someone with medical knowledge, with access to a post-trauma patient, allowed a finding on imaging to go unreviewed for 18 hours. And that same someone has a professional connection to the physician who just had me fired from the only hospital within 90 miles. Wyeth set the tablet down on the chair she'd vacated. Outside the building, somewhere on the installation, a vehicle was moving. She could hear the engine, the particular pitch of something with more weight than a staff car. then another one, then a third. She looked toward the window at the end of the corridor. Through the glass, in the early blue light of a Montana dawn, 3 military vehicles had pulled through the checkpoint and were moving toward the medical facility with the quiet, organized purpose of people who had been briefed and were arriving on schedule. "Who else is here?" she said. Wyeth straightened. "The JAG team that reviewed your record," he said. "They've been on their way since 2 this morning." She turned and looked at him fully. "They're not just here about my record, are they?" "No," he said. "They're not." And she understood, standing in that corridor in clothes she'd been wearing for going on 18 hours with a plastic coffee cup in her hand, and the weight of everything she still didn't know pressing from all sides, that whatever had started in the ICU at Harlan County Regional Medical Center tonight had not ended when they walked her out through the front entrance. It had, in some way she was only beginning to understand, just begun. The JAG team came in 3 vehicles, and they moved like people who had already decided what they were doing, which was different from people who were still figuring it out, and Mara had spent enough time around both kinds to know the difference on sight. There were 4 of them. 2 in uniform, 2 in civilian clothes that fit the way civilian clothes fit people who don't usually wear them, slightly wrong across the shoulders, slightly too deliberate. The lead was a woman named Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Damov, and she introduced herself in the corridor with the particular economy of someone for whom time was a finite resource she was actively rationing. "Sergeant Voss?" She didn't extend her hand, she assessed. "You look like you need 8 hours of sleep." "I've been hearing that a lot tonight." "Can you function?" "That's also the second time I've been asked that." Something shifted in Damov's expression. Not quite a smile, more like an acknowledgement that the observation had registered. "Good answer," she said. "Come with me. I need to brief you before we talk to Baird, and I want to do it before he has time to make any calls he shouldn't be making." "You're moving on Baird now?" "We're having a conversation with Baird now. Whether that conversation becomes something else depends on what he says." She was already walking. "Major Wyeth filled you in on the access pattern?" "The file queries, yes." "There's more." She pushed through a door into a conference room that someone had clearly been using as a staging area. Laptop bags, printed documents, a whiteboard with writing on it that Mara caught only partial glimpses of before Damov moved to block her sightline in a way that wasn't quite deliberate, but wasn't entirely accidental either. The research program connecting Fort Crail and Harlan County Regional has been under preliminary review for the past 5 months. Financial irregularities, grant reporting inconsistencies. Nothing criminal on its face, or nothing that could be clearly named as criminal until approximately 6 weeks ago, when a junior researcher at the program's administrative office submitted an internal complaint. What kind of complaint? The kind that suggests certain clinical outcomes at Fort Crail were being managed in ways that benefited the program's metrics rather than the patients. Mara stood very still. "Managed," she said. "That word is doing a lot of work right now, yes." Damov sat down and opened a folder. "Captain Payne's admission 18 hours ago was, we believe, an inconvenience for Baird specifically because Payne had been scheduled to be transferred to a different facility next week. A transfer that would have moved him outside the scope of this installation's reporting. If his post-trauma recovery had proceeded on the trajectory Baird documented, the transfer would have looked routine. But if someone caught the missed bleed, then the documentation of his condition gets scrutinized. The timeline of his treatment gets scrutinized, and things that were supposed to look uncomplicated start looking very complicated." Damov looked up from the folder. "You walked in here and ordered a repeat CT. That's going to be inconvenient for several people." The conference room felt smaller than it was. "Payne's bleed," Mara said. "Was it genuinely missed, or—" "We don't know yet," Damov said, and the flatness in her voice when she said it was the flatness of someone who suspected they did know but needed the process to confirm it. "That's one of the things we're going to find out this morning." Mara looked at the whiteboard. At the partial names and connecting lines she could see around Damov's shoulder. One of them was Foss. Another, slightly lower on the board, was connected to it by 2 lines with a question mark between them. "What does Garrett Foss have to do with this?" she said. Damov followed her gaze. She didn't move to block it this time. "We're still mapping that," she said, "but Foss has a publication history with Baird going back 9 years. And Foss was the physician who filed the termination report on you within 30 minutes of your clinical intervention tonight." She paused. The speed of that report, the speed with which it was actioned, That's not normal procedure. He wanted me out of the building. He wanted you out of the record, Damov said. There's a difference. If you're terminated for policy violation, your clinical observations that night become the observations of a terminated employee who violated protocol. They become much easier to dismiss. Mara thought about the supply cart, about 2 years of being the janitor with a badge, about all the small, deliberate ways a person's credibility can be eroded before the moment when their credibility actually matters, and how efficient that erosion becomes when it's applied consistently over time. He knew who I was, she said, before tonight. We believe so. How long? Damov closed the folder. That's the question that concerns us most, she said, and it's the one we don't have an answer to yet. Baird was in his office, which was the choice of someone who wanted to appear unconcerned, or possibly the choice of someone who had run the available options and decided that his office was the best defensive position. He was behind his desk when Damov entered with Mara and one of the civilian JAG staff, a man who introduced himself only as Rel, and who had the kind of face that gave nothing away in either direction. Baird looked at Mara first, then at Damov's rank insignia, then at Rel. I wasn't informed this meeting was scheduled, he said. We're informing you now, Damov said. How is that? He didn't answer. He was recalibrating. Mara could see it, the internal adjustment of someone who had walked into a situation expecting a certain set of variables and found the equation had more terms than anticipated. Captain Payne is in surgery, he said. The repeat CT was... The imaging team's red indicated a finding that was not clearly present on the initial... Major Baird, Damov said, I'm going to stop you there because the next thing you say is going to be part of a formal record, and I'd prefer you understood that before you continued. The office went quiet. Baird's hands, which had been resting on his desk with studied casualness, shifted slightly. I want to clarify what my rights are in this context, he said. That's a reasonable thing to want, Damov said. Rel opened a document and began speaking in the measured, procedural tone of someone reciting language they had recited before and would recite again, which was somehow more alarming than any tone that contained heat. Mara watched Baird's face while Rel spoke. She'd been in rooms like this before, rooms where the official language was doing its work, and the person on the other side of it was deciding how much they already knew and how much the people asking them questions knew, and trying to calculate the gap between those two things. She'd been in those rooms as a subject once, and she recognized the arithmetic happening behind Baird's eyes. He had not expected the JAG team. He had not expected it tonight, specifically, which meant he'd expected to have more time than he had. Dr. Baird, she said. Everyone looked at her. Damov's expression shifted slightly. She hadn't asked Mara to speak, but she didn't stop her. The junior researcher who filed the internal complaint, Mara said. 6 weeks ago. Did you know about it? Baird looked at her for a long moment. I don't know what you're referring to, he said. Okay, she said. Then let me tell you what I observed when I looked at Captain Payne's chart tonight. His initial imaging was read as clear. His management plan was conservative. His trending data over the subsequent 18 hours showed a consistent directional change that should have triggered at minimum a reassessment and possibly earlier repeat imaging. She kept her voice level. I'm not a physician, but I've been doing this long enough to know the difference between a patient who is recovering slowly and a patient who is moving in the wrong direction. Payne was moving in the wrong direction and nobody adjusted. Post-trauma hemodynamics are... I know what post-trauma hemodynamics look like, she said. I've managed them in the field with less equipment than this installation has in one supply closet. What I saw tonight didn't look like normal post-trauma variation. It looked like a patient who had a finding that was being managed as if it wasn't there. The air in the room was very specific now. Baird's eyes were doing something complicated. You're making an accusation, he said. I'm describing what I observed and asking whether you have an explanation for it, she said. Those are different things. You told me that earlier, remember? When you said I wasn't a physician. Something moved across Damov's face that might have been appreciation if she'd let it get that far. Baird looked back at Damov, away from Mara, back to the authority in the room that he'd been trained to engage with, away from the one he didn't have a category for. Remember, I'd like to speak with an attorney, he said. That's your right, Damov said. And the moment you exercise it, this conversation ends and the formal process begins. She let that land. I'm giving you an opportunity to speak informally first. That opportunity has a limited window. The fluorescent light in the office hummed. Somewhere in the building, Mara could hear the distant institutional noise of the installation beginning its morning. Doors, voices, the particular acoustic signature of a place coming online. Baird's jaw moved. He didn't speak. Formal process, Damov said simply, and stood. The next 4 hours ran on the particular fuel of institutional procedure in crisis, which is not a fast fuel, but burns very hot. Damov's team set up in the conference room and worked through a sequence of interviews and document reviews that Mara was not part of. She was not JAG, she was not military in her current status, and there were rooms and conversations she had no standing to enter. She sat in the corridor again. Different corridor, same plastic chairs, different bad coffee from the same brand of vending machine. Wyeth checked on her at intervals. At some point, Colonel Harkin walked past with 2 of the JAG team and stopped long enough to say, "Pains out of surgery. The bleed was fully addressed. He's going to recover." She said it to Mara directly, which was not something she needed to do. She could have said it to Wyeth, who could have passed it along. But she said it to Mara, and then she walked away without waiting for a response, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. Mara drank the bad coffee. She thought about Lance Corporal Derek Souza, 22, from Billings, alive in a hospital bed 90 miles away. She thought about Captain Aldrich Payne, 37, who'd gone into surgery with a bleed that had been sitting in his chest since the previous afternoon and had come out the other side of it. She thought, without quite meaning to, about Firebase Caro, about the decisions she'd made in the dark with inadequate equipment and the specific arithmetic of triage, which is not a clean arithmetic, which does not produce clean answers, which leaves residue in the people who perform it regardless of whether they performed it correctly. Decker had said she abandoned someone. The footage said she hadn't. She'd been carrying the weight of a lie for 3 years, and the weight had compressed her into something smaller than she'd been before. And she'd mistaken the compression for stability, which was a mistake she apparently needed to get to Montana to understand. She was still in that particular territory of thought when Wyeth came around the corner at a pace that pulled her back to the present. "We have a problem," he said. She stood up. Baird requested an attorney. Damov expected that. What she didn't expect was who the attorney is. He stopped in front of her. "The firm is out of Washington. They represent, among other clients, the federal program officer who manages the Fort Crail research funding." "That's not a coincidence," she said. "No. And it means someone notified that firm before Baird asked for an attorney, because there's no way legal representation from a DC firm arrives in response to a request made 40 minutes ago. Someone made that call last night." She thought about the file access, the military record query, the timestamp that overlapped with her termination paperwork. "The person who flagged my file," she said. "They notified the legal team at the same time they ran the query." That's the current theory, yes. Which means they anticipated that Baird would be in a room with JAG this morning. Or they anticipated that the situation at Fort Crail was becoming unstable, and last night was the trigger that accelerated the timeline. He ran a hand across his face. She noticed for the first time that he was also running on no sleep, that the professional composure was doing real work right now. "There's a third thing, and this one you need to hear before it gets to you a different way." She waited. "The termination report Foss filed," Wyeth said. "It was sent to the Montana State Nursing Board overnight. Someone requested an expedited review of your license. The basis cited is the policy violation at Harlan County, unauthorized entry into a restricted treatment area, unsanctioned clinical intervention." The corridor was quiet. "They're going after my license," she said. "They filed the request at 2:17 this morning. That's less than 2 hours after you left the building." His expression had the quality of someone delivering information they'd hoped not to be delivering. "If the board moves on it, you could be suspended pending review, which would affect your status here, which would remove me from the picture entirely," she said. "Yes." She stood with that. It was one thing to be fired from a job. It was another thing to have someone move against the license, the actual credential, the thing that made the work possible in any context, with that kind of speed and that kind of coordination. That wasn't Foss acting on professional offense. That was Foss, or whoever was directing Foss, understanding exactly how to ensure she couldn't surface again. 2 years of being the janitor with a badge. The nickname made different sense now. She wondered, for a moment, that she allowed herself and then closed off, how long she'd been managed, how long someone with knowledge of her background had been making small, deliberate choices to keep her credibility low and her profile contained. Whether the night shifts and the supply cart and the specific texture of her marginalization at Harlan County Regional had been entirely organic, or whether some of it had been engineered was too clean a word for it, shaped, oriented. Can the board's review be countered? She said. Damov is already drafting a response, Wyeth said. Your military record, the JAG findings on Caro, the clinical context of both interventions tonight. It's a strong counter, but it takes time. How much time? More than we have this morning. She looked at the window at the end of the corridor. The Montana dawn had finished resolving into actual daylight now, flat and white and honest, the way mountain light in March tends to be, without the softness that comes later in the year. What happens to the investigation if I lose my license and can't be here? She said. You're a witness either way, Wyeth said. Your observations tonight are documented. Your testimony doesn't require an active nursing license. But Damov loses an advisor. Yes. And Baird's attorney now knows the JAG team was working with a clinical advisor whose credentials are under active board review. Wyeth was quiet. That's a pressure point, she said. The attorney is going to use it. Probably within the hour, Wyeth said. Yes. She thought about the two patients. She thought about Damov's conference room and the whiteboard with the names and lines. She thought about Derek Souza alive in a bed in Clarkfield and Aldrich Payne in recovery down the hall, and the 3 years she'd spent getting smaller so that nothing could attach to her, and how well that had worked out. I need to talk to Damov, she said. She's in session with, I know, I need 5 minutes. He looked at her. What did you figure out? He said. I'm not sure yet, she said. But there's something about the timeline that's wrong, and I need to say it out loud to someone who can check it. She was already moving. The initial CT on Payne, who read it, not who reviewed it, who physically read the imaging and produced the report. Wyeth pulled out his phone and started moving with her. The on-call radiologist, he said, standard protocol. Who is the on-call radiologist at Fort Crail? He looked at his phone, pulled up something, stopped walking for a half-second. The rotation logs show. He looked up at her. The radiologist on call when Payne's CT was processed was a Dr. Minda Farr. She's a contractor, not installation staff. Is she connected to the research program? He was already dialing. They reached the conference room door. Mara knocked twice and opened it without waiting for an answer, because the situation had moved to the point where waiting for answers was a luxury that had expired. Damov looked up from the table with the expression of someone who had been interrupted and was deciding whether the interruption warranted the cost. The radiologist who cleared Payne's initial imaging, Mara said. Dr. Minda Farr. She's a program contractor. She read the CT that documented him as stable. If she's connected to the funding structure, then the documentation of his stability was produced by someone with an interest in documenting him as stable, Damov said. She said it fast, which meant she'd gotten there herself or close to it. She looked at Rel. Get me Farr's contract history, she said. Now. Rel was already moving. Mara stood in the doorway while the conference room shifted gear around her. The thing about a system of dishonesty, she had learned over the years, was that it required maintenance. It required people in specific positions doing specific things. And when one of those positions got disrupted, when the wrong person walked through the wrong door and looked at the wrong chart and started asking questions that were supposed to have been forestalled by 2 years of careful, systemic discrediting, the whole structure became visible in a way it hadn't been before. You couldn't see the frame until someone stepped outside it. She was outside it now. She'd been outside it since 4 a.m. in a parking lot in Clarkfield, holding a plastic coffee cup and taking a phone call she'd almost ignored. Voss? Damov said. She looked up. Farr's contract documentation is going to take 30 minutes to pull, Damov said. In the meantime, Baird's attorney has requested a brief recess, and we've granted it. She held Mara's gaze. I want you to walk me through the clinical picture on Payne one more time, in detail. Because when we go back into that room, I want to be able to respond to anything the attorney raises about the basis for the repeat imaging. You want me to brief you? I want you to tell me in plain language what you saw and why it mattered. She pulled out a chair. Sit down. You've been standing in a hallway for 4 hours. Mara sat down. She started talking. She was 40 minutes into the debrief, and Damov had filled 2 pages of notes when the door opened and Rel came back in. His expression was the expression of someone carrying information that was going to change the shape of the room. "FAR's contract," he said. "The program officer listed as her point of contact for Fort Crail is the same individual who is listed as a co-investigator on Baird and Foss's last 3 joint publications." The room went very still. "Name," Damov said. Rel said the name. Mara didn't recognize it, but Damov's face did something that Mara hadn't seen it do before. A fractional shift, a compression around the eyes, the expression of someone who has just watched 2 things they already knew connect into a single thing they hadn't fully assembled yet. "That's not a program officer," Damov said quietly. "That's a deputy director." "Of what?" Wyeth said. Damov closed her notebook. "Get me a secure line," she said, "and nobody leaves this room." Wyeth moved to the door. Mara sat in her chair and felt the shape of the thing they were all standing inside change, expand outward in a direction that had not been visible from any of the angles she'd been looking at until this moment, and understood that what had started as one nurse being fired from one hospital in Montana was not the beginning of the story she'd been placed inside. It was the end of someone else's story. And someone very far up, a very important chain of command, was about to find out that the woman they'd spent 2 years grinding into irrelevance had not in fact been made irrelevant. The secure line connected. Damov said 2 words into the phone, a name and a location, and then she listened, and the color left her face. Damov stayed on the secure line for 11 minutes. Nobody in the room spoke. Wyeth stood near the door with his arms at his sides and the particular stillness of someone who understood that moving would be the wrong choice. Rel had his tablet open but wasn't looking at it. Mara sat at the conference table and watched Damov's face do the work of processing whatever was coming through the line. The small compressions and releases that were the only visible evidence of an interior response being carefully managed. When Damov ended the call, she set the phone down on the table with deliberate quiet. "The deputy director," she said, "is Harlan Skeet. He's been in his current position for 7 years. He oversees a portfolio of joint civil-military research programs across 4 western states. 3 of those programs are funded through the same appropriations channel as the Fort Crail initiative." She stopped. "He is also, as of 40 minutes ago, not at his office in Denver." "Where is he?" Wyeth said. "His assistant says he took emergency personal leave yesterday morning, before the incident here with Payne." She looked at Mara. "Before you intervened at Harlan County Regional." "The conference room," Mara said, not a question. "He knew something was coming loose," Damov said. "The internal complaint filed 6 weeks ago. The junior researcher who submitted it went through a program internal channel first. Skeet's office would have seen it." She stood. "He's been managing the exposure since then. The file queries on you, the preparation of Baird's legal representation, the nursing board complaint, those aren't reactive moves. Those are a contingency plan being executed." "He built the contingency around me," Mara said, "around my credibility being destroyed before I could be a useful witness. You and potentially others, but you were the proximate risk because you were in the hospital where one of his people worked, and because your military background meant your observations would carry weight that an ordinary nurse's might not, if anyone bothered to look at what you'd actually done before Montana." Damov moved to the whiteboard. She picked up a marker. "Here's what we have established. Baird and Foss co-published with Skeet's office 3 times. FAR, the radiologist, contracts through a company that Skeet's program funds indirectly. The research metrics at Fort Crail showed a recovery rate anomaly that triggered the original internal complaint. And Skeet ran a query on your classified military file at 2:03 in the morning, 50 minutes after you saved Derek Souza, and 30 minutes after Foss filed his termination report." She drew a line on the whiteboard connecting 2 names. "That query is not explainable," she said. "A federal deputy director has no legitimate reason to access the sealed personnel file of a civilian ICU nurse at 2 in the morning. It's the thread. And we're going to pull it." "How long until you find him?" Wyeth said. "He hasn't used his personal cards since yesterday. His government vehicle is at the Denver office. His phone last pinged a tower outside Colorado Springs at 6 yesterday evening and then went dark." She capped the marker. "Someone helped him move, which means this is not one person managing a quiet exit. This is a network trying to fold itself up before the light gets to it. Mara looked at the whiteboard, at the names and lines, at the shape of a thing that had been built carefully over years and had held its shape because the right people had been in the right positions, and because the wrong people, people like her, had been systematically placed where they couldn't see clearly enough or speak loudly enough to matter. She'd been placed. She understood that now with a completeness she hadn't had an hour ago. Not the full architecture of it, not every decision that had been made to keep her contained, but enough. Enough to understand that the 2 years in Clarkfield hadn't been random, that her application to Harlan County Regional had been processed in a way that left her visible to people who needed to know where she was, that the night shifts and the supply cart and Garrett Foss's particular species of cruelty had served a function beyond his own ego, though his ego had certainly been a willing instrument. She had been managed, and then she had refused to stay managed, and a Marine who was 22 years old had lived because of it, and a captain in surgery down the hall was going to recover because of it. And now she was sitting in a conference room at a federal military installation at 8 in the morning while a JAG lieutenant colonel drew lines on a whiteboard connecting people who had spent years making sure she couldn't do exactly what she was doing right now. It should have made her angry. It did make her angry, but underneath the anger was something else, something older and more stable. The thing that had kept her moving through 16-hour shifts and bad coffee and Foss's voice carrying across hallways at a volume calibrated for her to hear. The thing that had gotten her out of the car in the parking lot at Patton's Diner at 4:30 in the morning and across a table from Wyeth when everything in her that was tired and scraped down was telling her to drive away. She was still here. She had been here the whole time. Baird's attorney arrived at Fort Crail at 9:47. He was a man named Cutler Prain, late 40s, gray suit, the kind of professional effect that was designed to communicate that he had been in rooms like this before and found them largely unremarkable. He shook Damov's hand with the practiced warmth of someone who wanted her to know he wasn't hostile, while also wanting her to know he was not here to be moved. Mara was not in the room for the formal session. She sat in the corridor with Wyeth and a cold cup of coffee and the particular quality of waiting that she'd gotten good at, not passive waiting, the kind where your mind goes soft, but the kind where you stay sharp and present and let the information come to you rather than chasing it. She heard voices through the conference room door. Not words, just cadences. Prain's voice doing what attorneys' voices do when they're building a case for why something doesn't mean what it appears to mean. Wyeth's phone buzzed. He looked at it. Farr, he said quietly. Minda Farr. She surrendered to federal marshals in Missoula 20 minutes ago. Mara looked at him. She went voluntarily? Her attorney negotiated a cooperation agreement overnight. He looked up from the phone. She had a family, 2 kids. Her attorney told her what voluntary cooperation looked like compared to the alternative, and she made a decision. What did she give them? We don't know yet, but she had documentation. Emails, imaging records with timestamps that don't match the official logs. Internal program communications going back 14 months. He put the phone away. 14 months is when Skeet's office first flagged your personnel file, Mara. She said nothing. They've been watching you since before you knew there was anything to be watched for, he said, and Farr knew about it. She was at Fort Crail when your file first came up in a program meeting. A program meeting, she said. Skeet ran assessments on anyone in the regional medical community whose background created a potential risk to the program's integrity. People with the training to recognize what the anomalous outcomes actually indicated. He stopped. You were on a list. She breathed through that. How many people were on the list? Farr's documentation mentions 4 names. You're one of them. He looked at her carefully. The other 3 are no longer in positions where they'd be likely to observe anything connected to the program. What does that mean? 2 were transferred. 1 resigned. He paused. The resignation came 3 weeks after that person received an anonymous complaint to their licensing board. The morning light was coming through the window at an angle that hit the floor and made a sharp line across the linoleum. Mara looked at it. They've done this before, she said. The complaint mechanism. Yes. Farr's documentation suggests it was the established response to anyone who got close enough to the program's outcomes to ask the wrong questions. The conference room door opened. Prain came out first, then Damov, then Rel. Prain was doing the thing good attorneys do when a session has not gone the way they'd hoped, keeping the surface smooth, the professional demeanor intact, giving nothing away on the face, while everything in the posture communicated that the calculation had changed. He stopped when he saw Mara. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she'd seen before. The expression of someone revising their estimate of a situation based on new information about its components. Then he kept walking. Damov came to stand beside her. FAR's cooperation agreement includes testimony on the imaging protocol at Fort Crail, Damov said quietly, and communications between Baird and Skeet about the specific patients whose outcomes were documented under the program's metrics. She paused. Captain Payne's admission was flagged in those communications 17 hours before he arrived at this installation, before the training incident that injured him. Mara turned to look at her fully. Before, she said. Payne was due to be a transfer patient. He'd been at a different facility prior to this posting. His medical history included 2 previous trauma episodes that would have been statistically interesting to the program's dataset. Damov's voice was even and completely controlled. The training incident that brought him to the trauma bay here was reported as accidental. Was it? That, Damov said, is now a separate investigation. Baird came out of the conference room at 11:15 with Payne at his shoulder and the expression of a man who had been through a very long night and a very long morning and had arrived at the other side of both understanding that the position he'd held for 6 years at this installation was not going to exist in the same form by the end of the day. He walked through the corridor without looking at Mara. Or rather, he tried to. He was almost past her when he stopped. She didn't know why he stopped. Maybe Payne shifted. Maybe something in his peripheral vision registered and refused to let him keep moving. He stopped, and he turned, and he looked at her directly, which was the first time he'd looked at her directly without the structure of a clinical argument between them. His face was doing something complicated. "The CT," he said. His voice was lower than it had been in his office. "The initial read. I didn't—" He stopped. Payne put a hand on his arm. "Leonard," Payne said. Baird ignored him. "I want you to know that the patient—" He stopped again. "Payne. He's going to recover," Mara said. Something moved through Baird's face that she couldn't name exactly. It wasn't relief. It wasn't remorse, quite. It was the specific expression of someone who has been a certain kind of person for a certain number of years and is only now, in this corridor, with the architecture of that life actively coming down around them, beginning to measure the actual distance between who they were and who they told themselves they were. "I know," he said. Then Payne steered him away, and they went down the corridor and through the doors at the end, and Mara stood where she was and watched them go. Wyeth appeared at her elbow. "You okay?" he said. "I don't know yet," she said. "Ask me again later." The formal proceedings against Harlan County Regional Medical Center's administrative decisions began at 2 in the afternoon, when Damov's team submitted an emergency filing to the Montana State Nursing Board that included Mara's military record, the JAG findings on the Firebase Cairo inquiry, the documented clinical outcomes of her 2 interventions, and a 14-page brief detailing the coordinated nature of the termination and licensing complaint in the context of the broader federal investigation. Mara didn't write any of it. She sat in a room and answered questions when Rel came to find her, and she was precise and specific, and she did not editorialize, because editorializing was not what the moment needed. What the moment needed was the facts laid out in the order they happened, which she was good at. At 3:40, Wyeth brought her a sandwich from somewhere in the installation's dining facility and sat down across from her. "The board suspended the expedited review," he said. "Foss's complaint is on hold pending the investigation." She ate part of the sandwich. "Foss," she said. "Where is he?" "Still at Harlan County. The hospital's legal counsel contacted Damov's office about an hour ago. The board of directors is convening an emergency meeting." He paused. Apparently the hospital administrator, Foss's direct superior, was not aware of the speed with which the termination and licensing complaint were filed. When it was explained to him this morning, he had questions for Foss that Foss is apparently having trouble answering. "He didn't act alone," she said. "No, but the administrator didn't know the extent of it. He thought Foss was managing a policy complaint. He didn't know Foss had a pre-existing connection to Skeet's program." Wyeth looked at the table for a moment. "The hospital took your badge and cut your paycheck and escorted you out of the building at 4 in the morning because Foss told them you'd violated protocol and needed to be removed. That's what they knew. The rest of it? He shook his head slightly. The administrator is using the word betrayal a lot in his conversation with legal counsel. She thought about Brenda Sollers hesitating before she called security. She thought about Walt Ruiz saying Garrett in one word that contained a volume of meaning. She thought about the residents who'd laughed in the hallway, and the nurses who'd whispered in break rooms, and the ordinary humans who'd made ordinary human choices about alignment and silence and self-preservation. She wasn't generous enough to excuse all of it, but she was honest enough to know that most of what had happened to her at Harlan County was the product of one man understanding how to use a system, and most of the people in that system had simply been the system, not the force directing it. The sandwich was mediocre. She finished it anyway. At 4:30, Damov came to find her. She looked different from the morning, not tired exactly, but processed. The way people look when they've moved through the acute phase of a crisis and are now in the sustained operational phase that's less dramatic and more exhausting. "Skeet," she said. "We found him." Mara sat up. "Colorado. A property outside Pueblo. It's registered to a company that traces back through 2 LLCs to a consulting firm that Skeet incorporated before he took the federal position." She sat down. He was there with a laptop and approximately 4 years of program documentation that he was apparently in the process of curating. I was destroying files. He'd started. He hadn't gotten far. Something moved through Damov's expression. The marshals executed the search warrant at 3 in the afternoon. He was taken into federal custody at 3:07. The room was quiet. "What happens now?" Mara said. "Now the process does what processes do. It moves." Damov looked at her directly. "The record correction on your separation is being formally processed today. The Firebase Caro inquiry findings will be officially documented and attached to your personnel file. The commendation—" "I don't need the commendation," Mara said. "You've been recommended for it twice. The recommendation is part of the record, regardless of whether you want it." She didn't have an answer for that. "Your nursing license is not at risk," Damov said. "The board was provided documentation this afternoon that makes the basis of Foss's complaint not just unfounded, but potentially actionable on his part." She paused. "Your position at Harlan County Regional is another matter. The termination was procedurally executed. The hospital followed its own protocol, initiated by someone who had the standing to initiate it. The investigation into Foss's external connections may affect how the board views the underlying circumstances. But that's a separate track. I'm not asking for my job back," Mara said. Damov looked at her. "What are you asking for?" It was a direct question, and it deserved a direct answer, and Mara sat with it for a moment because she hadn't actually framed it as a question yet, hadn't gotten past the urgency of the immediate into the territory of what came after. "I'm asking for the record to say what actually happened," she said, "at Caro, and here, and at Harlan County." She looked at Damov steadily. "Not a version of it, the actual thing." "That's what we're building, Damov said. "Then that's what I'm asking for." At 6 in the evening, Colonel Harkin asked to see her. Her office was small and organized with the precision of someone who used physical order as a management tool. Everything in a specific position, nothing left to chance. She was standing when Mara came in, which seemed to be her default. "Captain Payne is awake," she said. "He asked for the nurse who caught the bleed." Mara stopped. "He doesn't know it was me," she said. "He doesn't know your name. He knows someone caught something that should have been caught earlier and wasn't, and that this person was not part of the installation staff." Harkin looked at her. "I told him the situation was complicated. He said he'd been a Marine for 15 years and complicated was not a disqualifying factor." Mara almost smiled. "Can I see him?" "I wouldn't have told you if you couldn't." Payne was in the recovery room at the end of the medical wing, hooked to a monitor that was reading everything steadily and well. He was pale from surgery and the blood loss that had preceded it, and he had the particular quality of a person whose body had recently been through something significant and was now conducting an internal accounting of the damages. He was awake. He looked at her when she came in, and there was the brief moment of adjustment that happens when a person who's been in a certain amount of pain meets someone new. The gathering of resources, the decision about how much of the situation to present. "You're not from here," he said. "No." "You the one who ordered the CT?" "I suggested it. A physician ordered it." He was quiet for a moment. Suggested it, he said, with a quality in his voice that made clear he understood the weight of that word in that context. Suggested it to Baird. Yes. He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was in that direction. Baird doesn't take suggestions, he said. He did that one. Payne looked at her for a moment. I've been at this installation for 8 months, he said. Something has been off about this place since I got here. The way patient outcomes are talked about. The way certain conversations get redirected when you're not supposed to notice. He shifted slightly against the pillow, then thought better of it. I filed a report about it 4 months ago, through internal channels. Mara went still. What happened to the report? She said. My unit CO received a communication suggesting that my perception of the situation reflected stress-related factors and should be addressed through the wellness program. He looked at the ceiling. I'm 37 years old and I've been deployed 4 times. I know what stress-related perception problems look like. What I was describing wasn't that. I know, she said. He looked back at her. The people investigating this, he said. They're going to need documentation of that report. My CO will have it. He won't want to surface it because it reflects badly on how it was handled, but it exists. I'll make sure that gets to the right people, she said. Yeah. He seemed to consider something. Who are you? She thought about the supply cart, about the parking lot at 4 in the morning, about Firebase Caro and the 3 years of compressed, airless existence she'd built in the aftermath of someone else's lie. I'm a nurse, she said. From Clarkfield. He looked at her steadily. From Clarkfield, he said, with the tone of someone who understood they were not receiving the full answer, but was deciding it was the right answer for now. Get some sleep, Captain, she said. You had surgery this morning. She was almost to the door when he said, Hey! She turned. Thank you, he said. Not the reflexive thank you of social obligation, the other kind. She nodded once and left. At 8:15 that evening, Wyeth found her in the corridor where she'd spent most of the day, which at this point had become something like a base of operations by default. He had his phone out, and he looked like someone who had received information they weren't sure how to position. Foss, he said. He resigned. She looked at him. An hour ago. The hospital's board of directors convened at 5. The external legal counsel laid out the scope of the investigation and the nature of Foss's connections to Skeet's program. The administrator put a suspension and a formal inquiry to the board. He paused. Foss resigned before the vote. Did he say anything? His attorney issued a statement. The statement says he acted in good faith in accordance with hospital policy and looks forward to demonstrating that in the appropriate venue. Wyeth put his phone away. Which is attorney language for he's terrified and has no idea how much they actually have. She sat with that. Garrett Foss resigning wasn't the same as Garrett Foss being held to account. She knew that. Process was slow and imperfect, and the full consequences, whatever they turned out to be, were months away at minimum. But he had walked out of the building that had been his instrument, and the instrument was no longer his. She thought about the day she'd walked out of it. She'd had no badge and a plastic cup of cold coffee, and 2 years of being called the janitor with a badge. And she'd sat in a parking lot and received a phone call she'd almost ignored. She wondered what Foss had in his hands when he walked out. She thought probably not much. There's something else, Wyeth said. She looked at him. His expression had shifted into something she hadn't seen before. Something that wasn't quite official, something that was trying to stay professional, but had a quality underneath it that was closer to personal. The commendation, he said. The Silver Star recommendation. It's been formally processed. He stopped. There's a ceremony. It's standard when a commendation of that level is officially recorded, a formal presentation. The battalion that you served with, he stopped again. Wyeth, she said. Several of the Marines you served with during Operation Red Valley have submitted requests to attend, he said. 14 requests specifically. Each of them submitted independently. Damov's office forwarded them to me this afternoon. He looked at her. 14, Mara. In the middle of an active federal investigation, on 24 hours of notice. They found out and they submitted the requests. She didn't say anything. The corridor was quiet. The installation's nighttime rhythms had settled in. Lower voices, softer footsteps. The particular register of a building that was still working, but working differently. The ceremony is being scheduled, Wyeth said. You'll have input on timing and location. She looked at the window. The Montana dark had come down again, same as it had the night before, same as it did every night out here. Flat and total and indifferent to whatever was happening beneath it. But something was different from last night. Last night she had sat in a parking lot and felt the weight of 2 years and the weight of 3 more before that, and the accumulated gravity of being made small and then smaller still, until the original shape of the person she'd been was almost theoretical. Tonight she felt it differently. She felt the weight of the same things, but underneath the weight, something else, something that had been there the whole time, that hadn't actually gone anywhere, that 2 years of supply carts and whispered nicknames and targeted bureaucratic cruelty had compressed but not extinguished. She was still here. She had been here the whole time. "One more thing," Wyeth said. She turned. His face had that careful quality again. "Damov has been in contact with 3 senior administrators at Harlan County Regional. The ones above Foss's level who didn't know the full context of what was happening." He paused. "They've requested a meeting with you." "What kind of meeting?" "The kind where a hospital that has just become aware it was used as part of a federal-level interference scheme tries to figure out what they owe to the person who was most directly harmed by that." He paused. "And where the clinical director, who has reviewed both interventions from last night, has some things he wants to say directly to you." She looked at him. "They want to offer you your position back," she said. "Among other things," he said carefully. She let out a breath. "I don't know what I want," she said. "You don't have to know tonight." "No," she said. "But there's something that's been bothering me since this morning, and I haven't had the space to name it until now." She looked at him directly. "Skeet's list had 4 names. I was one. The others were transferred or resigned. But the internal complaint, the one Farr had documentation of, that complaint came from a junior researcher inside the program." She paused. "That person submitted it 6 weeks ago. Who are they? And where are they now?" Wyeth's expression went still. "We have a name," he said slowly. "A woman named Petra Vask, Junior Research Coordinator, Fort Crail Program Office. She submitted the internal complaint and then went on what the program records describe as personal medical leave." He looked at Mara. "She hasn't been located yet." The corridor was very quiet. "Wyeth," Mara said. "I know," he said. "If Skeet's people responded to her the same way they responded to the others—" "The marshals are working on it," he said. "It's active." She looked at the window again. The dark outside was the same dark. But somewhere in it, a woman named Petra Vask had done the right thing 6 weeks ago in an office that was not safe for doing the right thing. And then she had disappeared into whatever the people who ran that office did to people who did the right thing in the wrong place. And nobody had found her yet. They found Petra Vask on the 3rd day. She was in a motel outside Havre, Montana, one of those roadside places that exists in the margin between towns, the kind with exterior corridor doors and a vending machine that takes cash only, and a parking lot visible from the highway so you can see who's coming before they arrive. She'd paid in cash. She'd used a name that wasn't hers. She'd been there for 19 days, which was 12 days longer than she'd expected to need to be there, because she'd been waiting for something to happen that hadn't happened yet, waiting for the complaint she'd filed to produce a visible result, for someone somewhere in the system to move on what she'd given them. And instead she'd gotten silence, and then she'd gotten scared, and then she'd made herself very small in a room with a broken heater and a window that looked at a concrete wall, and she'd waited. Wyeth told Mara at 7 in the morning, 2 days after Skeet was taken into custody outside Pueblo. Mara was in the installation's small dining facility with actual coffee. Someone had brought a decent bag from somewhere, and the improvement was significant enough that she'd noticed it when he came through the door with his phone and the expression of someone delivering news they'd been hoping to deliver for 48 hours. "She's okay," he said first, which was the right thing to say first. "Where?" he told her. Mara set down the coffee. "How did she know to run?" she said. "She got a call," Wyeth said, "from a number she didn't recognize. The voice told her that her complaint had been received by the wrong people and that she should not be at her apartment." He paused. "We think the call came from Farr." Mara looked at him. "Farr warned her. Before Farr made the cooperation agreement, before any of this became visible." He sat down across from her. "Farr knew what the program did to people who surfaced problems. She'd seen it, and she made a phone call to a young researcher she'd never met because she couldn't not make it. He looked at the table. People are complicated. Yeah, Mara said. They are. Petra Vask was 26 years old, and when the federal marshals brought her to Fort Crail for a debrief with Damov's team, she came in looking like someone who had spent 19 days in a motel room with a broken heater, making herself as invisible as possible. Thin in the face, with the particular quality of alertness that extended periods of low-grade fear produce. The kind that doesn't switch off immediately just because the immediate danger is gone. She sat across from Damov in the conference room, and she had a folder in front of her that she'd carried in from the motel. And the folder contained a physical copy of everything she'd submitted in her internal complaint, plus additional documentation she'd assembled in the weeks since, printed, because she'd been afraid to use any device that could be tracked. Mara wasn't in the debrief. She was in the corridor. But when Petra Vask came out afterward, Damov brought her through the corridor, and the young woman stopped when she saw Mara. She looked at her for a moment. "You're the one who caught the bleed," she said. "On pain." "Yes." She nodded slowly. Something in her face was doing complicated work. Relief and exhaustion, and the particular aftermath of fear, which isn't clean or simple, but tends to arrive as a mix of emotions that don't have obvious names. "I filed the complaint because I couldn't keep looking at the numbers," she said. "The recovery metrics were being reported in a way that didn't match the actual patient records. I thought there was a process for that you file it and someone looks at it and corrects it." She stopped. "I didn't know how deep it went." "Most people don't," Mara said, "until they pull the thread." "I was terrified," she said, and there was something important in the way she said it, the absence of apology around it, the willingness to name it as simply what it was. "For 19 days I was completely terrified. I thought I'd made a mistake. I thought no one was going to do anything, and I was just going to be—" She stopped. "Gone. Just gone from the thing I'd spent 4 years building, and nobody would know why, and the program would keep running." "You didn't make a mistake," Mara said. "I know that now." She looked at her hands. "But you know what the worst part was? Sitting in that room by myself wondering if the right thing was also the stupid thing. If doing the right thing just meant I got disappeared while everything else kept going." Mara thought about a parking lot in Clarkfield, about a supply cart and 16-hour shifts and the particular mathematics of deciding how small to make yourself in order to survive inside a system that had decided what you were worth. "The right thing and the stupid thing look identical from the inside," she said. "For a long time, sometimes for years." She looked at the young woman directly. "You're here. The program isn't running." Petra Vask looked back at her. "Are you okay?" she said. "I mean, I know what they did to you, your license, the file access. Are you actually okay?" It was such a direct question and so unexpected that Mara didn't have an immediate answer ready. Most people in the preceding 48 hours had been giving her information or asking for it. Nobody had asked her that. "I'm working on it," she said, which was the honest answer. Petra nodded like that was sufficient, like she understood that working on it was its own kind of answer, and then Damov moved them both along and the corridor went back to its ordinary institutional hum. The federal charges against Harlan Skeet were filed on a Thursday, 6 days after his arrest outside Pueblo. Mara read the filing on a tablet in Colonel Harkin's office, because Harkin had printed it and then thought better of printing it and handed her the tablet instead. The charges included wire fraud, obstruction of a federal investigation, abuse of position, and 2 counts related to the improper manipulation of federally funded research outcomes. The filing named Skeet as the primary architect of a scheme that had operated across 3 states and 7 separate clinical programs over a period of 4 years, generating falsified outcome data that had been used to justify continued federal funding and to position the research program for a significant contract renewal. The contract renewal, a $112 million appropriation that had been pending approval, was suspended pending investigation. Baird was named as a co-conspirator. He had not ultimately taken the informal path Damov had offered him, which meant he was now navigating the formal one with Prane and whatever remained of his professional reputation providing whatever buffer they could manage. Prane was a good attorney. It wouldn't be enough. Mindafar's cooperation agreement had been accepted. She faced administrative and licensing consequences that were real and would cost her. She understood that, and her attorney had not tried to minimize it. But she was not facing criminal charges, and she was not in custody, and her children were in school this morning, the same as they'd been every morning before the motel in Missoula, and the federal marshals, and the things she'd done that had required her to dismantle the professional position she'd spent 12 years building. Mara read about FAR in the filing and felt something she couldn't simplify into a single word. FAR had been part of the mechanism. She had read imaging and documented findings in ways that served the program's metrics rather than the patient's. She had done that for money and for the security of a consulting arrangement that paid well, and asked only that she look at things in a particular way and report what she saw accordingly. But she had also called a 26-year-old researcher she'd never met and told her to run. People were complicated. Mara had been telling herself that for 2 days now, because it was true and because it was the only framing that made it possible to hold all the pieces of the preceding week in the same space without one of them canceling out the others. Garrett Foss was named in the filing as an associated individual, not a co-conspirator, not yet, which meant the investigation was still mapping the precise nature of his connection to Skeet's program and the degree to which his actions had been directed versus opportunistic. His resignation from Harlan County Regional was effective. His medical license was under review by the state board on the basis of conduct unrelated to Mara. The investigation had surfaced 2 prior incidents of documentation irregularities that predated her arrival and that the hospital's previous administration had handled quietly rather than reporting. He had been doing versions of what he did for a long time. Mara hadn't been the first. She'd just been the one who'd been in the right place at the wrong time for the people who needed her manageable, and in the right place at the right time for a 22-year-old Marine from Billings whose chest she'd read correctly in a hallway while holding a cleaning cloth. Harkin let her sit with the tablet for as long as she needed. When she set it down, Harkin looked at her with the direct, unornamented assessment that seemed to be her default mode of engagement. "The hospital meeting," Harkin said. "Harlan County's administrators. Wyeth said you hadn't decided." "I still haven't." "What's the sticking point?" Mara considered. "I spent 2 years there being something I wasn't," she said. "Not because I had to, because I thought making myself smaller was how you survived." She looked at the tablet on the desk. "Going back means walking through the same doors. I don't know if I can do that without carrying all of it with me every day." "You'd carry it anyway," Harkin said. "That's not a function of geography." "I know." "So the question is whether carrying it somewhere else is actually better, or whether it just feels cleaner because it's unfamiliar." Harkin's voice wasn't unkind. It was the voice of someone who had worked through versions of this question in her own life and was offering the result of that work without dressing it up. Clean feelings about a place are temporary. What you do in the place is what stays. Mara didn't answer immediately. "You should come back to the course," Harkin said. It landed not as a pitch, but as a statement of what Harkin actually thought, which was different. Not as a re-enlistment, as a reserve clinical consultant. There's a program structure that would fit your background. You'd keep your civilian license, your civilian work, whatever that ends up being, but you'd have a formal role. Wyeth mentioned something like that. Wyeth was being diplomatic about it. I'm telling you directly. Harkin leaned back slightly. You functioned at this installation under conditions that most civilian medical consultants would have found disorienting at best. You identified 2 separate critical clinical failures in the space of 1 shift, in a building you'd never entered before, while running on no sleep and a significant amount of institutional trauma. She paused. That's not something most people can do. It's something you do because of what you are, not what you've been doing for the last 2 years. Mara looked at the window. The Montana morning was coming in at a low angle, the way it did in the weeks approaching spring. Still cold, still with the flat hardness of late winter, but with something beneath it that was beginning to suggest it might eventually relent. I'll think about it, she said. Harkin nodded once. That's all I'm asking, she said. Well, Derek Souza was discharged from Harlan County Regional Medical Center on a Saturday, 8 days after he'd arrived by ambulance, with a failed chest decompression and a blood pressure that had been trying to tell everyone something nobody wanted to hear. His mother had driven from Billings when she got the call and had not left the hospital until he was cleared for discharge. And she was there in the pickup truck in the patient discharge lane when he came through the doors in a wheelchair. Hospital protocol, not necessity. He was walking fine. And she was crying in the way that mothers cry when the worst thing that almost happened to their child has been clearly and demonstrably avoided. He'd asked to speak with Mara before he left. She'd driven back to Clarkfield the day before for the meeting with Harlan County's administrators, which had gone the way meetings go when an institution has recently been confronted with the gap between what it believed it was doing and what it was actually doing, carefully, with a lot of legal counsel present, with a quality of focused accountability that institutions produce when they are sufficiently alarmed and sufficiently aware that the alarm is warranted. The clinical director was a man named Walter Aussie, who had been in his position for 3 years and who had reviewed both of Mara's interventions the night of the incident with the attention of someone who was building an understanding rather than constructing a defense. He'd asked her specific questions. He'd listened to the answers without interrupting. When she'd finished, he'd looked at her for a long moment and said, "We failed you, and we failed 2 patients by extension, and I want you to understand that I'm saying that as a statement of fact, not as a precursor to a negotiation." She'd told him she appreciated the distinction. The hospital's offer included reinstatement at a senior clinical level, not just her previous position, but an expanded role that included formal consultation standing in the ICU, the kind of standing that meant her observations were documented as clinical contributions rather than unauthorized interventions. Full back pay for the period following termination. A written acknowledgement included in her employment record of the circumstances of both her termination and the nursing board complaint, and the determination that neither reflected clinical failure on her part. She hadn't said yes in the room. She'd said she needed a few days, which she did, and they'd given it to her without pressure, which told her something. So she'd been in Clarkfield the morning Derek Souza was discharged, and she'd gone to the hospital and found him in the discharge lounge with his mother beside him, and his color good, and his eyes clear, and the particular quality of someone who knows they've come through something and is still calibrating what that means. He looked up when she walked in. "You're shorter than I expected," he said. She stopped. "I don't know what that means," she said. "I don't either. I was unconscious." He smiled, which was younger looking than the rest of him. "Somebody told me you were the one who, in the hallway, with the chest." "Yes." While a physician who outranked me in every meaningful way was explaining to me that I shouldn't be making observations, she said. He looked at her with the flat, unadorned assessment of someone who had been in environments where the difference between the right call and the wrong call was a body count. "You made the observation anyway," he said. "I've been making observations people didn't want me to make my entire career," she said. "I'm not good at stopping." His mother laughed, which surprised Mara, and then didn't, because it was the kind of laugh that has relief all the way through it. Sousa was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," he said. Same as Payne had said it. Same quality. Not the reflex version, the other one. "Get better," she said, "and don't go back to whatever you were doing when you got hurt." "It was a car accident," he said. "Then drive carefully." His mother laughed again, and Mara left them there in the discharge lounge with the morning light coming through the hospital's lobby windows, which was a better light than the ICU had at 4 in the morning, a more forgiving one, and she walked out through the front entrance of Harlan County Regional Medical Center on her own terms and into the cold March air. The commendation ceremony was held 3 weeks later at Fort Crail because Harkin offered the installation's formal hall, and because Mara had no preference about location, and Harkin's preference was the most organized one available. It was not a large ceremony, it was not a public event. The Marines who had submitted requests to attend had been given clearance, and 14 of them came, some from nearby postings, some from considerably farther, one from a posting overseas who had apparently burned personal leave for a flight connection that took 31 hours and had landed in Montana that morning and would return the following day. Mara didn't know until she was standing in the hallway outside the hall that 14 people had come. Wyeth told her 10 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, and she stood in the hallway with that information for a moment while the noise of the assembled people on the other side of the door came through as a low, steady hum. 14, she said. 14, Wyeth confirmed. She looked at the door. I haven't seen most of them since before Caro, she said. I know. I don't know what to say to them. You don't have to say anything specific, he said. They're not here because they expect a speech. They're here because they know what actually happened, and they wanted to be in the room when the record said so officially. She nodded. She wasn't okay exactly. She wanted to be clear about that. at least to herself, standing in a hallway, about to walk into a room full of people who had known her before the version of herself she'd been in Clarkfield. She was not the clean, resolved version of a person who has been through something hard and come out transformed into someone better. She was the actual version, the one who still woke up sometimes with the particular quality of darkness that Firebase Caro left in her, the one who had spent 3 years and then 2 more years carrying a weight that had compressed her into shapes she hadn't chosen, the one who had made herself small and quiet and then refused, at a specific moment in a specific hallway, to be small and quiet one more time. That was not a story with a clean ending. It was a story with a true one. She opened the door. The hall was not large, rows of chairs, most of them full. Harkin at the front in dress uniform. Damov standing to the side with Rel, both in uniform. Wyeth followed Mara in and took a position near the back. And the Marines. 14 of them, scattered through the chairs in the way that Marines scatter in civilian contexts. Slightly too upright, slightly too still, with the bearing that stays even when the uniform is off, and the posting is years in the past. They were various ages, various ranks. Some of them she recognized immediately, faces she hadn't seen in 3 years, but that were in the particular category of faces that don't fade, because they were present during things that don't fade. Some of them she needed a second look to place, because people change, and 3 years is not nothing. All of them looked at her when she came in. She walked to the front of the room. Harkin spoke first. The formal language of a military commendation ceremony, which has its own rhythm and its own weight, the language of institutional record being corrected and acknowledged in a setting where correction and acknowledgement carry formal force. She read from the citation, which described the events at Firebase Caro with the clarity that only becomes available when the evidence is no longer filtered through a single interested account, and the room was very quiet while she read. Mara stood and listened to a description of what she had done, and it was strange to hear it from the outside. Strange and disorienting in a way she hadn't anticipated, because she'd spent 3 years hearing a different description, the one Decker had produced, and somewhere in those 3 years the two descriptions had merged in her memory into something that wasn't quite either of them, a version of events that had Decker's conclusion attached to her own recollection of the decisions she'd made. Hearing the citation read aloud separated them again. She had done what the citation said she had done. She had done it in the conditions it described. The outcome it listed had happened because of decisions she'd made, not despite them. She had known this, in the part of her that dealt in the flat facts of physical events. She had not been able to feel it, which was a different thing. She felt it now, standing in a hall in Montana with 14 people who had not needed a JAG review to tell them what they already knew, because they had been there. Harkin placed the silver star in her hands. It was lighter than she expected. She didn't know what she'd expected. She'd held other people's medals before, in other contexts, and they were always lighter than they seemed like they should be, given the weight of what they were supposed to contain. She held it and looked at it for a moment. Then she looked up at the room. The 14 Marines were standing, all of them. She hadn't seen them stand. She'd been looking at the medal, and then she looked up, and they were standing, and the room was completely silent, except for the low hum of the installation's ventilation system and the sound of her own breathing. She didn't have a prepared statement. She hadn't prepared one because she hadn't known what she would want to say until she was standing here. And now that she was standing here, the thing she wanted to say was simple enough that it didn't require preparation. I made myself small for 5 years, she said, because I believed a version of events that someone else constructed about what I'd done and who I was. She looked at the medal in her hand. I thought if I could get small enough, the weight of it would be manageable, that I could carry it without feeling it if I just reduced the surface area it had to press against. She stopped. That's not how it works. Smaller doesn't mean less pressure. It just means less room to breathe. The room held that. I want to thank the people in this room for being here, she said. Not because you had to. Because you knew, and you came anyway, and that means something that I don't have a word for. She looked at Damov. She looked at Harkin. She looked at Wyeth, at the back, who had called her staff sergeant at 4:30 in the morning in a diner on Route 12, and whose face right now was doing the thing that faces do when people are trying not to visibly feel something they are very clearly feeling. She looked at the 14 Marines who had burned personal leave and flown 31 hours and driven however many miles to be in a room while a piece of paper officially said what they already knew. "I'm still figuring out what comes next," she said. "I think that's allowed." The meeting with Walter Oss at Harlan County Regional happened the following week, and she said yes. Not because the hospital had changed overnight. It hadn't. Institutions changed slowly and incompletely and with significant backsliding, and she had no illusions about the gap between what Ossie said in his office and what the ICU would look and feel like on a Tuesday night 6 months from now. She said yes because the work was real and the patients were real, and she was good at it, genuinely good at it in the way that matters, the way that shows up in the gap between a patient who lives and a patient who doesn't. She said yes also because Asa said something toward the end of their conversation that she kept coming back to. He said, "The reason this happened, the reason 2 patients were at risk on the same night in 2 different facilities, and the reason the system around both of them failed, isn't just Foss or Baird or Skeet. It's the part that came before all of them, the part where someone like you can be in a building for 2 years and what you know and what you've done doesn't register to the people around you because of how you arrived and what you were given to carry." He looked at her across the desk. "I want to build something here that changes how that works. Not as optics, as structure. I need someone who understands what the failure looks like from the inside." She'd thought about that for a long time. She understood what the failure looked like from the inside. She'd been living inside it. She started the following Monday. The ICU on a Monday morning was the ICU on a Monday morning. Controlled noise, complex patients, the particular rhythm of a unit that never fully stops. Brenda Sollers was at the charge desk when Mara came in, and there was a moment between them, brief, not comfortable, but honest, where Brenda looked at her with an expression that had an apology somewhere in it that she didn't know how to fully articulate, and Mara looked back at her with the understanding that she was not obligated to make that easier than it actually was. "Morning," Mara said. "Morning," Brenda said. That was all. It was enough to begin with. Walt Ruiz came off an overnight and stopped when he saw her. "Heard you were coming back," he said. "Heard correctly." He looked at her for a moment with the 19 years of this unit visible in his face. "Good," he said simply, and went to get his jacket. Some of the residents she didn't know. New rotations, new faces. Some of the nurses she knew by the quality of their hesitation when they saw her, the particular way people carry guilt at a low operating temperature. She didn't perform forgiveness. She wasn't there to make people feel resolved about their choices. She was there to work. She worked. 2 months after the commendation ceremony, Harlan Skeet entered a plea that was described by the federal prosecutor's office as partial. He accepted responsibility for some charges while contesting others, which his attorneys had calculated was the best available position, given Farr's cooperation agreement and Petra Vask's documentation and the forensic accounting that had traced the program's falsified metrics back to decisions Skeet had personally approved. The plea was entered in a federal courtroom in Denver on a Tuesday, with no public gallery, just the procedural participants and the record. Mara was not there. She was in the ICU at Harlan County Regional, monitoring a 63-year-old post-surgical patient whose pressure she'd been watching all morning with the focused attention that looks, from the outside, like calm, and is actually something more active than calm, something closer to what a very good listener does when they're not talking. Wyeth texted her the news at 11:43. She read the text between chart entries. She thought about what Skeet had built, the years of it, the careful placement of people, the construction of mechanisms that would ensure the wrong questions never got traction. She thought about the researcher he'd never met, Petra Vask, sitting in a motel with a broken heater because she'd filed a complaint through the right channels, and the right channels had been owned by the wrong person. She thought about the 4 names on the list that Skeet's office had maintained, the people assessed as risks, the people who had been transferred or pushed out or quietly ground down until they were no longer in positions where they could see clearly enough to ask the question that needed asking. She thought about herself at the bottom of that list. Staff Sergeant Mara Voss, placed in a Montana hospital where the man Skeet's program relied on, could ensure she stayed visible enough to monitor and small enough to dismiss. What they hadn't accounted for was that the thing making her a risk to their program was the same thing making her impossible to permanently diminish. You couldn't take away what she knew how to do. You could take her badge and her job and her reputation and the formal record of her military service. And she would still walk into a hallway and look at a patient and see what the patient was telling her. They'd tried to manage that. It had managed them instead. She put her phone in her pocket and went back to her patient. Bob. Petra Vask enrolled in a graduate program in public health administration that fall. She'd been offered her previous position back. The program was restructured under new oversight, the funding channel rerouted and audited, and the people directing it were in the process of being replaced from the top down. She declined the offer. She told Domov, who passed it along to Mara, that she didn't want to go back to the place the thing had happened. She wanted to go somewhere she could build something that made it harder for the thing to happen to someone else. Mara understood that completely. Captain Aldrich Payne was returned to active duty status 4 months after his surgery. His report, the one he'd filed 4 months before his injury, the one that had been redirected into the wellness program, was formally reviewed as part of the broader investigation and included in the evidentiary record. He'd been right about what he was observing. The institution had told him his perception was stress-related. He'd been a Marine for 15 years, and he'd known the difference, and the difference was now documented. He called Mara the day he was cleared for return. "I have a question," he said. "Go ahead." "When you walked into my room at Fort Crail, you didn't know me. You didn't know anything about the situation. You were running on no sleep, and you'd just been fired." A pause. "Why didn't you just not?" She thought about it. "I've asked myself that," she said. "I think the honest answer is that I've spent a long time trying to be invisible, and being invisible didn't save me anything. It just meant I was invisible." She stopped. "You were moving in the wrong direction. I knew what that looked like. Not doing something about it would have cost more than doing something about it. Even though doing something cost you everything." "It didn't," she said. It felt like it was going to. That's different." He was quiet. "That's a useful distinction," he said finally. "Yes," she said. "It is." There is a version of this story that ends with the ceremony, or with the plea, or with the first Monday morning back in the ICU when Mara walked through the doors that had last let her out at 4 in the morning with no badge and a plastic cup of cold coffee. But the actual ending is quieter than any of those moments, and it happens on an ordinary Tuesday, 6 months after the night Lance Corporal Derek Souza arrived on a gurney with his blood pressure in free fall and a chest that was telling anyone who knew how to listen exactly what was wrong. It's a Tuesday, and Mara is in the ICU, and a resident named Dr. Priya Anand, who has transferred to Harlan County Regional from Fort Crail as part of a program restructuring that OSAC lobbied for specifically, is working through a clinical assessment on a post-operative patient, and she's almost right. Almost. There's one piece of this picture she's reading slightly sideways, and she knows it. You can see it in the way she's looking at the chart, the slight uncertainty in how she's carrying herself. Mara comes to stand beside her. She doesn't take the chart. She doesn't correct Anand in front of the nursing staff. She says quietly, "What is his urine output doing over the last 3 hours?" Anand looks, pulls the number, looks back at the chart. Something shifts in her face. The click of 2 data points connecting into a picture that's different from the one she'd been looking at. "That's not where I thought this was going," she says. "It rarely is," Mara says. Anand adjusts her assessment. She makes a call. She handles it correctly. She doesn't thank Mara afterward, which is fine. Thanks are for extraordinary circumstances. This is just the work. But later, before the shift ends, Anand stops her in the corridor. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "In the room, the night when Sousa came in, you knew Foss was going to do what he did if you spoke up." "I knew it was likely, yes." "And you spoke up anyway?" "Yes." Anand looks at her. She's 28, maybe 29, with the particular combination of ability and self-doubt that shows up in people who are genuinely good at something but haven't yet fully trusted the evidence of their own competence. "How do you do that?" she says. "How do you speak up when you know what it's going to cost you?" Mara thinks about this honestly because it deserves an honest answer and not a clean one. "I'm not sure you calculate it," she says. "I think at some point you just understand that the cost of staying quiet is also a cost. It just gets charged differently, over a longer period, in smaller amounts that are easier to ignore." She looks at the corridor, at the doors and the light, and the ordinary working machinery of a place where people come when they need someone to know what they're looking at. You can spend years paying that way without realizing what you're paying for. Anand is quiet. So you're saying just speak, she says. I'm saying the version of you that knows something is wrong doesn't stop knowing it just because you stay quiet. She's still in there. And she's going to cost you more in silence than she ever would have cost you in words. The corridor runs in both directions. The work continues. Mara goes back to her patients, which is where she belongs, which is where she has always belonged. And the knowledge of that, the plain, solid, undecorated fact of it, sits in her chest, not as triumph or as resolution, but as something simpler and more durable than either of those things. It sits there like a floor, like something she can stand on, and that is what it means to finally stop running from yourself. Not that the hard things become easy, not that the years you spent bent under someone else's version of you are restored or reimbursed, but that you wake up in the morning and the ground beneath you is your own, and what you know is yours. And the hands you use to do the work are the hands you are always going to have, whether the people around you acknowledge them or not. They were there the whole time. So were you.